Welcome to this replay of one of the sessions from the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows 2022 Summit, Foresight Now, Harness the Future. We would like to thank our gold sponsors, Aurora WDC, Crayon, and Tyson Hines for their support. We would also like to thank our executive sponsors, the Business Intelligence Source, Commentelli, and Knowledge Inform. Please enjoy this session replay.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Chang Correa, and I'm a competitive intelligence fellow. As you know, perhaps from yesterday's introduction, I am the immediate past president and founding president of the CI Fellows. I'm also a CI and Foresight practitioner, instructor, and consultant, and I'm delighted to bring our two panelists to our next discussion. Now, so I want to start by just touching on Franz Johansson in his book, The Medici Effect. Illustrates powerfully that insights and innovation occur at the intersection of disciplines as we combine cross-disciplinary understanding, practices, and lessons. Our speakers today in this session exemplify this through their innovative insights to complex problems in organizations and on issues around the globe. So first, Professor Christoph Meyer is a professor of European and International Politics at King's College London and fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences. He's written widely on issues at the intersection of foreign security and defense policy, intelligence, international political communication, and the European Union politics. A cross-cutting theme of his work has been research on questions of anticipation, warning, and prevention in international affairs. He's co-authored his co-authored book on warnings about war, conflict, persuasion, and foreign policy won the 2021 Best Book Award of the International Studies Association. He is the lead co-editor on the new book, Estimate of Intelligence in European Foreign Policy Making, Learning Lessons from an Era of Surprise. Look out for this October, and I'll add that we'll share a discount code at the end of this session. I'm also pleased to introduce Jacob Rusinek. He's a private equity board governance specialist of the International Finance Corporation at the World Bank Group. He's responsible for board governance advice to IFC private equity-backed companies and emerging economies around the globe and helps place directors on boards of ISC-backed companies. The equity portfolio amounts to $12 billion. He's a change manager, organizational development leader with expertise in organizational effectiveness, team dynamics, project coordination. He applies program management tools and behavioral science to unlock barriers and produce transformational change for people, products, and organizations. 14 years in understanding and improving how people make decisions and drive ideas and interventions for international organizations. Prior to his role at the IFC, Jacob worked as behavioral science specialist with the World Bank Group. He's been responsible for diagnosing, designing, and implementing behavioral insight interventions in areas as energy theft, labor market programs, fragile conflict states, and organizational reforms. He previously worked with renowned behavioral economics professor Dan Ariely, among others, to support the efforts of streamlining behavioral science at the World Bank Group. And for each of our panelists, you can find more details about their work on LinkedIn via the Hopin platform. And so I would like to start squarely on our session theme, building off of our panelists' expertise, their cross-functional expertise and global expertise, in recognizing that we're surrounded by events and conditions that are building blocks of our futures. While there are many discussions about tools and techniques and foresight best practices, organizational leaders, intelligence and foresight practitioners and users often struggle to see indicators, signals, and patterns despite some very powerful tools and signal machines within their own organizations. So we've discussed in various summit sessions some of these struggles in program building and communication, and we've touched on some of these human factors and biases. So given all this, Christoph, you've researched extensively ways in which we can gain better early warning ahead of crises around the globe, from the Rwanda genocide to Ukraine invasion to the COVID pandemic. And Jacob, as a part of the World Bank Group's overall mission to eliminate global poverty, you've studied and addressed various organizational and regional barriers. So I'd like to begin by asking each of you, about the main types of foresight barriers you've observed in the various domains you've engaged with and researched. And I'd like to begin with Christoph, and then we'll we'll hear what Jacob has to say.
Yes, thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. Yes, my research is really concerned with the biases that go beyond the individual. So I'm interested in the social, institutional, and political embeddedness of bias and how they are driven by these kind of factors. So for me, foresight is actually not substantially different from other forms of knowledge claims. And all knowledge has different functions. One of the functions is, of course, to help us better understand and solve a problem. But at the same time, knowledge is also a tool for justification. It's an ammunition in political debates. It can help to legitimize or delegitimize organizations or policies. And therefore, knowledge is linked up with things like political interest, organizational culture, individual career perspectives. And I think it's very important to understand how foresight is embedded in those kind of tensions and structures. And I think there are different ways in which we can make sense of how biases are driven by factors that then influence the ability of analysts to accurately forecast, but also to interact with decision makers, because it's not enough to have accurate analysis. You do need to be able to communicate that analysis to decision makers in a way that makes a difference, that they notice it, that they accept it, that they prioritize it. So for me, there are four main factors that I'd like to mention briefly, and I'm happy to expand on them. So the first one is really a form of motivational bias that is linked to the political interest of the leaders, of decision makers, or indeed to the interest of organizations. So powerful organizations, powerful leaders often find ways of interfering in more or less subtle ways with the production and communication of knowledge, and that includes foresight. In my research, I've come across a number of cases, particularly in international organizations, where member states of international organizations did try to water down or suppress inconvenient reports and forecasts. And one of those areas was, for instance, the production of these watch lists of countries of instability, where there have been cases where member states intervened to get particular countries delisted from those watch lists because they were client states, there were strategic interests. So you can see how this makes it very difficult for analysts to just follow the knowledge and follow the data. And you could also see it in domestic politics. When, for instance, in Germany, we had this kind of killing spree of Germans with Turkish background that was really motivated by neo-Nazis. But the police, for a long time, thought this was linked to organized crime, and they didn't manage to escalate it to the federal level. And that had to do partly with organizational overlaps between the regional and the federal level that kind of fell in between, but also with the fact that this particular community didn't have much of a voice, was a bit marginalized. So it's less likely to be prioritized by an organization, and therefore it is then also less likely to feature in, I suppose, the analysis stage. Organizational overlaps and silos within organizations also have played an important role in the financial crisis, where regulators and financial and central banks and commercial banks as well didn't recognize the buildup of risk, the buildup of leverage, and what these leverage, these financial products, these derivatives actually meant, and therefore they were blind to the risk that these constitute, and that was part of the silos and the kind of underlap between organizations, that no one was really quite sure who is responsible for tracking that particular kind of risk and looking at the indications of risk. The third factor is organizational culture. And I think that's a field that has been well studied also in the literature on industrial disasters and accidents. These organizational cultures create distortions and blind spots for the analysis, including foresight, particularly organizations that are very hierarchical with a culture of blame shifting. They tend to encourage analysts to deliver knowledge that pleases the superiors and hold back, qualify, or hedge forecasts where they expect there will be pushback or indeed punishment from the top. So so they anticipate, or they think they can anticipate how their forecast, how their knowledge is being received, and that may often mean that decision makers actually don't get the warnings they deserve and that they need. Sometimes decision makers don't even notice that their own behavior is creating a problem for getting the knowledge they need to take good decisions. And I suppose we see what happens in the Kremlin at the moment with Mr. Putin clearly not anticipating that Ukraine would resist, and clearly is blaming the intelligence services. But the intelligence services felt, from the reports that one could read, that they couldn't actually tell the truth to Mr. Putin and the leaders. And maybe the last bit, which is perhaps a bit more speculative in terms of research, is our socialization in political structures, such as the structures that go with liberal democracy. So if we grow up in these structures, if we study these structures professionally at university, it means we often struggle to see what is different in countries that do not work in the same way. So political systems and societies that operate on the basis of kinship or tribe or religion, and where financial resources are generated in a very different way and distributed in a quite opaque way, leads us to analytical errors, because we tend to fill in the gaps of information by just thinking, well, what would I do? I mean, this looks like at home, this is how a military would look like, this is the power that a ministry has, when in reality the power is elsewhere. And military loyalties do not lie with the constitution or the government, they lie with the ethnicity, or they lie with the person who actually pays the family's income. So if we think back to the surprising defeats of ISIS the defeats of the Iraqi army by ISIS in Mosul 2015, or indeed in Afghanistan, we can see how that can really lead us to underestimate and misinterpret how these institutions work, how these actors actually work in foreign societies, because we have difficulties in transcending our own understanding of how a political system is meant to work, and who holds power, and how policy making is organized. So these are just 4 examples of distortions that kind of come on top of the cognitive biases that we are all familiar with: confirmation bias, mirror imaging, and so forth. I'm happy to explain later, if that is required, and what might be done against those.
This is a wonderful outline to get us started, Christoph. Lots to think about as well, and it dovetails very, very nicely with some of the discussions over the course of the past now day and a half. So I appreciate this, and so with you, Jacob, what are some of the main types of foresight barriers you've observed in the domains you've engaged with and researched? You're of course, with the World Bank Group and the IFC, and dealing with somewhat different problems, but you and Christoph are both really looking at macro environmental factors that many of us struggle with, because they're large, they're complex, they're also very foreign, right, to many of us, as Christoph has underscored.
Yes, no, absolutely, and thank you so much, Cynthia, also for having me on the panel, and good to see you again, Christoph, and hear your perspectives. Yes, we had a very interesting journey here at the World Bank, because what we, as many of the audience members may be assuming or knowing, is we've been following kind of the rational actor model historically in a lot of our projects, kind of in order to predict what future behaviors of some of our beneficiaries could be. And so, according to the rational actor model, and this comes from Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman's work, etc. One of the fundamental building blocks of that is that we as human beings kind of act in a way where we're trying to maximize our own utility no matter what, basically, and we're not taking into consideration things like what Christoph talked about, some of the cognitive biases, heuristics, etc., that we all bring to the table. So we at the World Bank, just as I think a lot of the world, and whether it's policy making or in the private sector, started embracing this concept of behavioral economics and bringing aspects from social psychology into policy making, really. And so that was an interesting journey, because, I would say probably for the last 10 to 15 years, the field has become rather popular. One of the reasons is that because, well-known psychologists like Dan Kahneman and others received Nobel Prizes as showing some of the irrationalities going on in our thinking process and decision-making process. And so we then developed a World Development Report back in 2015 that kind of looks at enhancing that rational actor model and looking at the more irrational side of how we make decisions and how we act and behave. And so I'm also going to use, just like Christoph, the number 4, because our work then was expanded by looking at 4 kind of additional factors or frameworks, if you will. And so one of those was, as I had mentioned, Dan Kahneman's work along the lines of the famous book that he wrote, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And here basically the concept shows that all of us have 2 different types of thinking. One is the more intuitive and automatic type of thinking, and the other one is the more deliberate, careful type of thinking, if you will. And the interesting thing about that is that depending on which type of thinking we apply to whatever we do, the outcomes differ very much. So here, simply being aware of that we can tap into a more deliberate way of thinking before we make a decision versus maybe the more intuitive thinking, can again help us in predicting some of the outcomes in the future. The second thing, which is also important to us, and I think Christoph also mentioned it, is looking at the context and the environment. So by all means, we don't believe that a human being will act exactly in the same way, depending on, independent of the environment that he or she is in. But we very much now recognize that it's important to look at whether the person lives in an area that is, affected by climate change or by other factors like that, or it's a city setting or a rural setting. And so there are plenty of empirical evidences right now to show that, 2 things that may seem similar on the onset, once you put them in different contexts, they will look very differently. The third thing is social norms. So again, I think historically we have not been looking at predicting future outcomes based on how people around us behave. So we've been looking a lot at us as an individual, thinking again or assuming that we will act in a certain way no matter how people in our environment will behave. Well, again, we looked at that research that shows that that is also not always the case. I think a famous example, if I may mention that, and some of you may be aware of it, is that there's a hotel bar or a hotel room that you stay at, and there's a little sign that says, "Please leave a tip for whatever you have consumed in the hotel room," right? And so on certain days they would put a picture of eyes watching you. And then on other days, they would just put a picture of flowers or whatever. And it's interesting because in that experiment, it was very clear that on days that you saw the eyes next to the sign and you felt basically watched, people would leave a much higher amount of a tip in the room. So it's just one basic little gimmickly example of how we do act and behave in a different way based on whether we perceive or how we perceive people acting and behaving around us. And maybe the last one I'll mention, and this is exactly along the same lines of what Christoph has mentioned, is that there's a lot of these cognitive biases and heuristics out there. And in my resources toolkit, you will see a website, a free website, where you have basically a glossary of the most common ones. And here, simply, I would say, simply being aware of these biases and heuristics that we all bring to the table, whether it's hyperbolic discounting, so overvaluing the present over the future, whether it's the endowment effect, so overvaluing the same item that we own versus the same item that we don't own, giving it a much higher financial value. The famous IKEA effect, that we put a lot more, we pay a lot more attention to items that we actually build and put labor in. Even if it's the same item on the market that we have not built, we will still overvalue the item that we've built, loss aversion, etc. So there's a lot of these biases, and I would agree with Christoph here, and also with what you suggested, Cynthia, is that being aware that all of that kind of impacts our decision making and how we believe others will behave in the future, it can enhance kind of our toolkit of trying to predict outcomes in the future.
I really appreciate this, and I'd like to go back to to what Christoph said too, regarding the recognition of foresight as knowledge work. Now, oftentimes we don't pay attention to this aspect. I mean, we tend to think about foresight and outcomes rather than the rigors, the integrity of the process and what we put into that. And so when we're thinking about different types of barriers to biases, part of the solution is really thinking more systematically about this. And so, Christoph, in your research, and Jake, you've worked with the knowledge management team at the World Bank Group. Do you have some insights for us about how we can think more systematically, programmatically about trying to minimize our biases and silos and other types of barriers that get in the way of seeing what we need to in a timely fashion?
Is that for me or for Jacob?
It's actually for both of you, because you both have wonderful perspectives regarding this. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think the starting point is probably to caution against overconfidence. So the overconfidence that comes from having a lot of data, great data, state-of-the-art methods. I think if we recognize that this is great and it's important, but it's not enough by far, that we do need to look at other aspects as well. And I think the guiding model, probably from a kind of organization perspective, needs to be that we need to make organizations as much into learning organizations as is possible, and we need to promote cognitive openness, yes, particularly at the senior decision maker level, in terms of providing them with training, but also look at cognitive openness through at the recruitment process, building teams that are diverse, so that we get challenge, we get different perspectives, we get questioning. I think all of this is very important to encourage not just foresight, but indeed to encourage a way in which decision makers engage with knowledge that is not completely free from power, not completely free from hierarchy, not completely free from interest, but as much as is reasonably possible, so that you can really, that decision makers can engage with the people who have the knowledge without going through 5 layers of management first, and where the knowledge is diluted and you got Chinese whispers and all sorts of different distortions are creeping in. And there is this literature on high reliability organizations that has looked at nuclear power plants and aircraft carriers and found that these highly security focused organizations have found a way of encouraging the reporting of errors and the bringing of inconvenient news. So if someone made a mistake, if the person reports that, they were leaving an important piece of equipment, that is encouraged, because it's absolutely security critical that when something goes wrong, that this is not hidden or concealed, because if it is, things can go really badly wrong. Of course, a regulator is not a nuclear power plant, and there are limits to which you can transfer things. But I think it is important to have that, to work with people who have the knowledge, and to encourage people to bring the knowledge into the organization. And when things go wrong, not to blame them, but to try and institute processes of learning from that, learning when things go wrong, learning from near misses as well. So when things nearly go wrong, but are still okay, you still need to institute processes of learning, post-mortems, critical incident investigations, and you need to do that regularly, not every couple of years when something goes really badly wrong, but as a kind of more routinized way. So it's about a learning organization that is strategic, and that values its staff, that values those who are producing knowledge. I think that is the core of what is also important for foresight.
Wonderful. And Jacob, what about your experience, as in behavioral science, as well as with the KM initiatives at the World Bank Group and IFC?
I would just kind of piggyback off a lot of what Christoph said. I mean, I think one of the things that we have tried to apply, and you've mentioned Dan Ariely's work in the beginning, he was actually the one who kind of coached us on this, is to really look at these behaviors on a somewhat of on a micro level, right? So indeed not make assumptions from kind of senior management perspectives of why things are not working. Also not go too fast into data and data gathering and just basically thinking that the data will provide all the answers. In our case, we developed a methodology called basically a behavioral diagnostic, where we would try to identify the concrete challenge that has to be solved. I mean, that is something that, you need to get stakeholders around understanding what the challenge is and what has to change. But then once the challenge is identified, again, don't think that you know why it's not working. Rather take an open mindset, try to be as to use the word receptive to learning as possible, and then maybe having a few toolkits in the back, right? So knowing about some of these concepts from whether it's behavioral economics or other areas, and then going into the scenario and really just observing, watching how people behave, how your beneficiaries behave, what they're doing, and trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And then your data gathering phase kind of starts and kicks in, and you should be obviously doing all these focus groups, qualitative interviews, quantitative surveys, whatever you can do to support numerically what you're observing. So then you can then build a better hypothesis on what may be really going on. And I know this may sound a little bit abstract, but I'm happy to provide, or maybe I'll just provide a very quick example of how we applied it in one of our projects. So we do a lot of development work. Obviously, we try to change policies in the countries, in our beneficiary countries, if you will. And so I remember we were called in on a project in the Comoros in East Africa, where there was an issue with electricity delivery. Basically, people were not paying their electricity bills, and so the big assumptions here were that, well, people are, it's a very poor country, people just can't afford paying the electricity bills, or there's not enough electricity supply in the system. And so it was kind of a very kind of, if you will, they were trying to find a hard solution to the problem by basically getting more generators into the country, et cetera, except none of this worked. So then they sent us in, and we did the 6 weeks of kind of this behavior diagnostic field work. And through very systematic, and again, initially just trying to observe both the supply and the demand curve, by the way, which is very important, we were able to figure out that, and knowing about these concepts from behavior economics that I briefly introduced, we figured out that there's so much more going on. So it wasn't always a fiscal reason why people were not paying. It was social norms, for example. People were saying, well, I'm not going to pay for electricity I'm not receiving. My neighbor is not paying for electricity he or she's not receiving. So why would I do that? So a simple observation of how the neighbor behaves made them often behave in a way where they thought it's a social norm and it's appropriate not to pay the electricity bill. And on the supply side, we saw that indeed there was actually enough electricity in the system, but what a lot of the utility employees did of that company, where they were underpaid, and they came up with their own social norms, where they basically created a secondary economy by allowing people to hook up to an off-grid electricity basis, and they created a complete black secondary economy. And again, this was driven mainly by social norms that the World Bank, in its kind of classic approach to development projects, has completely overlooked. So those were just some of the examples of how we go about trying to maybe get a bit of more of a realistic grasp on what's really going on the ground.
This is just absolutely fascinating. I really wish we had more time to delve into each of these answers, actually. But one thing that I do want to be sure we touch on, and this actually came up in a couple of sessions ago, where the panelists discussed the commenters discussed war games and some of the cultural aspects of having diversified teams. Each of you work internationally, and you work with you work with teams and subjects who are international. So you're already having to look cross-culturally, interculturally, and dealing with those dynamics as you're looking to harness the strength of diversity. But you're also having to manage some of the types of biases that might appear in the face of these contexts. There's so many questions I have regarding this, but I think that it's probably only fair just to start at the top and to just ask you, each of you, how do you manage this when you are looking at very complex cultural situations, trying to find solutions to this, whether or not you're studying subjects or whether or not you're trying to engage the subjects into some sort of behavioral change, and as you're trying to exercise foresight alongside that, how do you approach this so that you can have a manageable frame and you can find some effective outcomes to a practice that is still very squishy, for which there are still very few solutions?
I don't know, Christoph, if we want to turn around the order for a second.
Yeah,
and
let's start
then-
with you, Jacob, because you're knee deep in this, as you have been much of your career, and then we'll turn this over to Christoph.
Yeah, I'll just do a brief statement. Basically, it's interesting because intuitively, obviously, our work spans across the entire globe, mainly emerging economies. But intuitively, we would say that, cultural norms matter so much, right? And I would say in many aspects that's true. But the beauty to me in cognitive biases, heuristics, and behavior economics is that we all carry these biases within us, no matter the culture, or the culture doesn't maybe impact as much as we would intuitively assume. So whether it's, again, overvaluing, the present over the future, the whole concept of hyperbolic discounting, one could probably argue the same concept applies just as much in the US as it would maybe in the Comoros, Uganda, or Western Europe. Now, what is interesting though, and we've seen it in our work, and there's a wonderful book written about it called Scarcity, which some of you may also be familiar with, that shows that in certain contexts and cultures, these biases are play a very different role. Even though the bias may be the same, it manifests itself in a very different way, right? So, for example, again, this whole idea of hyperbolic discounting, where we overvalue the present over the future, is a big deal in countries where resources are constrained, right? Where people just don't know whether the next rain is going to bring, flooding to their fields, or the drought, how that's going to impact their livelihood, and therefore it's much, much harder for them, even if they conceptualize the idea of trying to put as much value in the future as we do in the present. It's going to be very hard for them just because their reality looks so different, right? So that would be my statement, is that the beauty of it is that these biases, I think, apply across many cultures, but they maybe manifest and play out in a very different way, depending on the cultural context.
Thank you. And Christoph, your thoughts on this?
Yes, I mean, I've got a lot of experience looking at international organizations, which are, of course, in some ways diverse because they're multinational, and you've got these different nationalities working together, and that should, in theory, give you hypotheses for free, alternative hypotheses. In reality, though, it is often the case that there's a perception that knowledge comes with national flags. So it's discounted because it's seen as serving the national political interest, rather than being open perhaps to learning from particular worldviews, different worldviews, historical experiences. These are partly discounted, and that's exactly what we had in the European Union with the Eastern European, Central European countries who had warned about Russia. And, the Western European countries thought, oh, well, they always say that they're paranoid. They didn't think that these countries have a particular advantage in terms of their knowledge. They saw that as a burden because they are traumatized by their histories, right? So ideally, you would kind of build teams that kind of bring those different perspectives together, these different nationalities, and use that productively. But that presupposes that you can you need to suspend the suspicion, at least for a moment, that everything is political manipulation, and that you start listening actually to each other. I think other ways of building diversity is I think you need to make sure that you are you need to do some extra effort. If you want to move outside the networks that you always have and the normal people you always have, you need to do something that you don't normally do. Mm-hmm. So if you have a meritocratic recruitment process, you may get different nationalities, but they all went to the same university and studied the same degree, right? That is not real diversity. So you need to make a real effort to kind of go beyond the easy communication and to reach the people you would not easily normally reach. And I think that's not easy at all. And when we see that sometimes that there is some sort of a sphere of people who think in the same way, also in the global south, or more kind of the developing countries, if I can say that, who know both codes. They know the code of the local society, but they also know the liberal Western code. and one can easily, if one only engages with that group of people, one doesn't really understand the country, even if you have someone from the country, but you still don't understand the country. So it's almost like an anthropological, ethnographic perspective to truly understand how people think differently. So I think these would be helpful ways in which you can get a bit more challenge into your organization. And perhaps the last thing that I should briefly mention, that this perhaps separate, I think organizations that run on very scarce resources and are very focused on one problem, that are running hot, they don't have the space for thinking. So you do need to ring fence a bit of resource. You need to give a bit of space for people to flag up problems that are not already prioritized. Otherwise, everything follows the prioritization from the top. And we've seen that also again with Russia. Everything in the UK, for instance, intelligence community was focused on counterterrorism and fighting jihad, extremist Islam, and very little resource went into Russia, anticipating the threat of Russia before 2014.
Yes. And so we have about 10 minutes left, to our time. It's just flying by too quickly for me. And so we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'd like to share with you. So our CI fellow and President August Jackson said, what is the track record of adherence to the scientific method among behavioral economists? I appreciate the findings, but are their results influenced by the experiment or analysis methodology, bringing in its own bias?
I'm assuming this question, because I've mentioned the field of behavioral economics, I'm assuming this may be more towards me, although I'm very curious from an academic perspective, Christoph, how you would respond to it. Again, I'm not from academia. I'm not going to go into kind of trying to, explain this away in one or the other way. But what we have done is, I think that's why I mentioned that we don't, some people are rather radical and they say that the behavioral economic model versus the rational economic model, right? So they say it's one or the other. Some people say we as humans basically behave irrationally and not rationally. I think in order for us to kind of not even fall into this discourse of where the empirical evidence is maybe cleaner, where there are less biases in play, we just said we're going to enhance our way of doing things through a new lens. And indeed, of course, all the policy making that we do has to be backed by as much scientific data as possible. So we do apply randomized control trials into our experiments where we can, but we not always have the luxury of time, unfortunately, where we really need to move things along so people will benefit, especially in emergency situations where we cannot always conduct thorough scientific experiments as we would like to. So I would say the short answer is we try to work with the best methodologies and tools out there as we can. In certain scenarios, we kind of try to apply something new because what we've done before hasn't worked. But obviously that won't guarantee that what we're going to try is going to work. And by all means, our own biases, I think in anything what we do, and in any model that we apply, our own biases do play a role. But I think maybe one of the beauties of doing these applied randomized control trials is to try to reduce the noise and reduce the biases, or at least through being aware of how these biases play out, try to have as clean of a result as one can have. And maybe the last thing I'll mention is that absolutely measuring all of that is key to us too, right? So we don't want to do this work just by saying, oh, we read some, some would consider pop psychology and we're just going to apply this now. No, we are, even in our behavioral diagnostics, we go into the field and we create big samples. We follow best practices in how we gather the data, how we analyze the data. And then again, we're trying to measure the results by applying RCTs where we can.
Yeah, so you do practice what you preach. Yeah.
Try to.
Yes, for sure. And also I think we need to recognize too that this is an ever growing and evolving body of research. So we're always having to adapt to our new understanding of this as well. And so with that, I'll turn to Christoph because he's among those creating that new understanding.
Yes, I think I can't actually add that much more to what Jacob has already said, but I would perhaps emphasize that indeed, I think as also one of the commenters said in the comments, but knowledge can come in different shapes and forms, and is of course refracted through different disciplinary lenses. So if you hire a lot of economists, they may have different training, but they're still economists, right? You could also think about what is the right mix of economists, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, engineers. They all bring different ways of producing knowledge, different ways of problem solving with each other. I think what is also important is, I think, to not completely forget about personality, kind of different types of cognitive personalities, and also how they relate to other people. So for instance, if you are a specialist in warning intelligence, you need to be comfortable with being in a minority. You need to be comfortable with peer pressure, because initially you're very likely to be in a minority who challenges the conventional view. So if you are not comfortable with asking stupid questions in a group, you're probably not the right one to specialize in warnings, right? So I think it's also a question not just of disciplinary backgrounds and having the right mix of people, but it's also about personalities and having enough people who are primarily, I think that's also what Tetlock and others wrote about, curiosity driven, rather than driven by some other motivation. So if you're really curiosity driven, then I think it's a bit more likely that you can work constructively through some of these biases, and that you can not eliminate, but perhaps reduce some of those motivational biases, or the fear, fear that your career may suffer and things like that.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple of more questions that I want to tackle, and then if we have time, I'd like to just loop back to that because that is just eminently fascinating. And another fellow, Claudia Clayton, who asks, what do you find is the most common derailing factor in an otherwise well-run process, or perhaps the top ones, top derailing factors?
I'll let maybe Chris take that one first. Christopher, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, it's. I think that the top one, again, at least speaking from an organizational setting, is that there's a very clear sense of what is it that the organization wants, what are its current priorities, what is going to be inconvenient, and this is not necessarily laid down in any paper. This is not necessarily a directive that comes from somewhere, but it's a kind of a social knowledge that everyone in the organization knows. So if the U.S. announces that it will withdraw from Iraq or withdraw from Afghanistan, you know that certain that it may be very inconvenient if you start investigating how well the U.S. trained national armed forces are going to perform against extremists. Are you really going to examine in detail whether the training has actually reached its objectives, whether they actually they have the combat power? This is not about censorship in a direct way, or interference in a direct way, or politicization. It's about that kind of understanding of what kind of knowledge is dangerous, inconvenient, problematic. And that influences in so many also very unconscious and indirect ways any process of analysis. And where do you want to go? Where do you dare to go? And I think that is probably the most pervasive influence that can distort things. Even if you have a well-meaning leadership in a well-meaning organization, it filters through in very nuanced, subtle ways to every level.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, Jacob, please.
No, I was just going to add along the same lines. I think the biggest, if I understand the question correctly, derailing factor to how we want to predict a certain outcome, I would say from kind of the work that we do is again, as I mentioned earlier, kind of making wrong assumptions based on maybe overly simplistic models or thinking models, right? So we, I think, have a tendency to, as humans, to often go into trying to find a quick solution to a challenge or a program, and that quick solution is based on what we've seen maybe in media, what we've heard others say, etc. But we don't really sometimes take the time to go and understand whether that assumptions that we're making is really indeed so, right? And I think the beauty of, I think, the type of work that I've been doing is that I would say in 9 out of 10 cases, when we go and really study the problem, we'll see that the assumption was actually completely wrong. And so I think it's a little bit similar to, if I understand Christoph correctly, what he's saying on a maybe more macro level, political level. We do that also on a micro level, is that we, every time we have a challenge, whether it's an organizational one or an external one, we try to steer away from making wrong assumptions and rather really go and take the time to really study of what's going on in terms of kind of human behaviors.
It's very powerful. And our final question here, and we've got another minute left, is how do you factor in corruption as we're trying to gain clearer foresight?
Yeah, that's probably more question for Jacob, but I think it's a question of whether you expect corruption or not. I mean, if you expect that, again, the case of the training of foreign armed forces, or indeed in the case of the Russian army, clearly we know now that there has been a lot of corruption, but that was not reported to the Kremlin, and it was not, I think, really fully acknowledged in the case of Afghanistan or Iraq, the degree of corruption. So you need to look for it. You need to be conscious of it, and that may be sometimes difficult if you are actually coming from a country and socialized into a country that has very low levels of corruption, and you perhaps don't have that kind of understanding. So I think it also really goes with questions of these kind of big worldviews and socialization, and indeed I think assumptions are often underpinning policies in a way that is not acknowledged. So I think the point that Jacob made about assumptions, the interest and the assumption are actually often quite linked without being properly acknowledged. So I would agree with him that it's testing assumption, questioning assumptions is very important.
And I would also add maybe not acting as if it doesn't exist, for example, right? Because when we hear the word corruption, especially in the context of my institution, obviously, that's another one. I myself had that big assumption before joining this place that, development work is so much full of corruption, right? And then the quick answer that a lot of people come up with to that, who believe in development work, is say, no, that's really not true. I think the truth is that, yes, it exists, right? It exists, and one of my colleagues here at the World Bank actually that published a lot of World Bank papers on it. Bob Barikas is his name, and he has shown how there's a significant correlation between development funds going into certain countries and decision makers in these countries building their own personal wealth, and so all the evidence showed that absolutely the money doesn't always end where we intended to end, right? Yes, to end, and so I think, but here again, my what I like about that is that we don't act as if it doesn't exist. We show it exists. We try to understand why it exists, and we try to then understand how can these processes, projects, etc., be improved so it exists less. So again, questioning, but also acknowledging when these types of challenges exist. I would say
Thank you.
I would add that.
Yeah, you've both given us much food for thought, and I just want to share that that our speakers have prepared for us some resources for those of you who want to pursue more of this. And you can see that here. Just all you need to do is just ping me on LinkedIn, and that's available. That link is via Hopin, and I can send that to you as a slide. And you can also see the emails, to our speakers here. And I mentioned to you that there is a discount code for Christoph's new book, so it's listed right over here. So just ping me for the slide deck, and I'll send it to you. And you'll also see additional works here of Christoph. It's quite extensive, and I do encourage you, to check this out. And one of my favorites actually is the Hidden Brain podcast, Cassandra Curse, which is how I discovered Christoph in the first place. So thank you both very much for joining us, sharing your depth of experience and wisdom, and how we can manage, many of the macro environmental factors as well as very human and organizational behavioral factors. You've given us so much to think about, and I wish we had more time. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed this session replay from the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows 2022 Summit, Foresight Now, Harness the Future. We also hope that you'll join us for future educational programming that advances the field of competitive intelligence and adjacent fields. If you'd like more information about future events, the Fellows, or our competitive intelligence community of practice, please visit the link in our Vimeo profile. Thank you so much.